Voting is a key tenet of democracy. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 made voting more accessible for Americans. But did you know that in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled out a major part of the Voting Rights Act? Shelby versus Holder was a Supreme Court ruling in which Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was dismantled. Voter suppression in America has always been an issue, specifically for Black Americans. Being as though we're at an HBCU, it is important to know the history of the battle to the ballot. Moreover, students at Prairie View have been fighting for voter rights for over 4 decades. Although voter suppression is not as blatant as it has been previously, it is important to identify legislation that might be discriminatory in nature. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amore Times. I'm a student at Prairie View A&M University, and I have witnessed the fight for voter rights firsthand. I've also conducted a research project with the undergraduate research program here at school on the topics of the Voting Rights Act, Shelby versus Holder, and its impact on states' legislation. In order to understand our rights, it's important to understand the history of voter accessibility and voter suppression. So today I will be explaining the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Shelby versus Holder ruling, and its impact. The Voting Rights Act was a piece of landmark legislation passed by Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965. The Voting Rights Act addressed practices used to deny the right to vote, such as poll taxes, the grandfather clause, or intimidation tactics. Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act had something called a preclearance, in which states were identified that had previously used discriminatory voting tactics. It created a formula to identify these states. States identified in Section 4 under the formula then went to Section 5, where they had to be under federal preclearance. They could not pass any voter legislation without approval of the federal government first. And it's important to note that the Voting Rights Act was renewed and expanded to ensure that all populations were covered. For example, in 1965, it was expanded to cover language minorities. So if there was a city that had a lot of Spanish speakers, there had to be Spanish ballots accessible. But the act could only be renewed if there was evidence that it still needed to be in place, i.e. discriminatory voting practices. So now that I've given an introduction of the Voting Rights Act, we will now discuss the Shelby versus Holder ruling. In 2013, the Supreme Court presented a ruling on Shelby County, Alabama versus Eric Holder. Essentially, the Supreme Court ruled that there was no evidence that the Voting Rights Act should still be intact, specifically Section 5, meaning that all states and jurisdictions were no longer held accountable because they weren't under preclearance. Following Shelby, many states passed restrictive voting laws, such as stricter voter ID laws and shortened early voting periods and closing the polls. Because there's no formula, states weren't required to report to anybody. Texas, for example, passed laws that had been previously disallowed by federal examiners less than 24 hours after the Shelby ruling. It was a voter ID law that federal examiners identified as discriminatory in nature, and 24 hours after Shelby was passed, Texas decided to pass that law. So today I've briefly explained the Voting Rights Act and the Shelby versus Holder ruling. The implications of Shelby have not yet been identified because there haven't been enough voting cycles to come to a full conclusion, but what we can draw from this is that it is important for voters to simply be knowledgeable about voter legislation and how it can affect you.